Hello, and welcome to another episode of South Pole, the podcast that explores everything Antarctica. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and today we are talking about penguins, Weddell seals, why they love each other, satellite imagery, and species from space. Our guest for today is Dr. Michelle LaRue, an associate professor at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand and a leading researcher in the field of Antarctic marine predators. Dr. LaRue uses high-resolution satellite imagery to track and study animals. She tracks their populations and behaviors, and she has looked at animals all over the world, but in Antarctica, she focuses on Weddell seals and emperor penguins, learning more about them from space. It's a pretty interesting episode, in my opinion, and it explores the intersection of cutting-edge technology and wildlife research. I think, without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. All right, welcome to the show, Dr. LaRue. It's wonderful to meet you. The first question I have is if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your research.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Michelle LaRue, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. And my research really is focused on trying to understand marine predators in the Southern Ocean. Some of the questions I'm interested in are fairly basic. It's kind of where are they located, how many are there, and how do they interact with their environment. And the way that I tend to do that is by looking at them from space. So using high-resolution satellite imagery, a lot like you'd see on Google Earth. And I use that kind of imagery to basically look at them and count them and learn all of these things. So it's been really interesting. I've learned a ton in the past couple of years, but that's, I guess, kind of where my research tends to focus is on the Southern Ocean.
Wow, you might actually have one of the coolest jobs on Earth.
I'm really lucky.
Well, I'm sure you worked very hard for it too. One question I like to ask at the top is if your research has ever taken you down to Antarctica, but I suppose if the data that you are looking at is collected from satellite imagery, maybe it's possible to do that remotely. I'm not sure, but I guess I'll just give you the question all the same. Have you ever been down to Antarctica, and can you tell us a little bit about your experiences there?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I went to Antarctica a couple of times before I ever started doing research on animals from space. So the first time I went to Antarctica was in December of 2008, and I was with a group where we were basically trying to create better maps of the McMurdo Dry Valleys. And so I had no idea how fortunate I was at the time. I knew I was very, very lucky, but I just didn't know how lucky I think that I got to do some camping in the McMurdo Dry Valleys and fly around in helicopters and take ground control points to try to make the maps a little bit better. So that was my first trip actually out of the United States. So I'm originally from the US. So my first trip out of the United States was actually to Antarctica, which is a pretty memorable trip in the first place. I remember when I was planning to go for the first time that somebody who'd been a bunch had told me this advice, which was, as soon as you get off the plane, you have to stand on the ice and just look around because it is absolutely unlike anything else you've ever seen. And they're going to try to get you onto the bus and get you to McMurdo as soon as possible. But she said, just sit there for 10 seconds at least and just kind of look around and pay attention. And so it's just a very unbelievable, it's unlike anything else in the world. And so I've been to Antarctica now a total of 10 times since 2008. And I would say I've been studying, animals from space for about 13 years, maybe 14 years or so.
Wow, yeah, I can imagine that would have been a very impactful first trip. And I guess you're still at it, right? I know that you've also used satellite imagery to map some animals that are outside of Antarctica. Can you tell me about what those animals are too and where they live?
Yeah. So the other work that I've done using, kind of the idea of animals from space has also focused in the Arctic, so literally the other side of the world. And so I've looked at polar bears and attempted to look for musk oxen as well in the Arctic. The musk oxen were very difficult to find. The polar bears, as it turns out, are fairly easy to see if you know what you're looking for and if you're looking at the right time of year for them to kind of come on land and in that case, they're these bright white, animals on kind of a dark background, which is basically the opposite of how Weddell seals, which live in the Antarctic, look, because they're black little dots on white ice. So I've gotten really good at kind of identifying very small objects on the landscape and counting them.
Okay, so lots of different species from space. Today, I think we'll spend most of the time talking about seals. You have used the satellite imagery to count Weddell seals in the Antarctic. Can you tell me a bit about this Satellites Over Seals project? SOS, I think it's called.
Oh gosh, good question. Okay, everything I can tell you about the Satellites Over Seals project was born out of the knowledge that we could see the animals from space. So that was like really exciting and really cool. But that was matched with this really difficult prospect of actually doing it. Like looking at the entire coastline around Antarctica is a huge undertaking. And so I partnered with my colleague Luke Barrington, who was one of the co-founders of a web app basically called TomNod. And what that allowed you to do is to have anyone in the world who had an internet connection could log in and look at these high resolution images with us and help us understand where the animals are. And so I was kind of flabbergasted, actually, that they were even interested in collaborating with me in the first place, because, like, who am I? Just kind of some random, researcher who wanted to count seals from space, but they were interested. And so that was really exciting. So we wrote a proposal to the National Science Foundation, and I couldn't believe that it got funded. And that was basically the beginning of, I think, a lot of really cool research projects since. And so we learned a ton. We learned that people are really interested in looking at animals from space. We ended up having about 300,000 people come through and help us look for, Weddell seals from space.
Okay, citizen science, we love it. Can I ask what the data tells us about the seals?
We learned that Weddell seals are very patchily distributed. So we kind of thought they were uniformly distributed around the Antarctic, and it turns out that's not the case. And we also figured out that there's only about a quarter of the number of animals as we thought we were going to find. So like the previous estimates from decades ago was about 800,000 or so Weddell seals we thought in Antarctica. And this time around, we found about 202,000 female seals. So quite a lot fewer than we had originally thought. And I guess the last thing I'll say is we also learned a lot about their habitat and why they are in these locations. And so we figured out that they like to be nearby emperor penguins as long as the nearby emperor penguin colony isn't too big. And they prefer to be farther away from Adelie penguins, which I think is kind of funny because the Adelie penguins are, very small compared to a Weddell seal, but they apparently don't like to be nearby them so much. So we really learned a lot about, how many there are, where they're located. And so now what that does is it allows us to move forward and say, okay, over time, how are these animals doing? Are they doing better? Are they doing worse? What causes their populations to fluctuate? And we've got all kinds of other questions that we can begin to ask now because of that research.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about those ones too, but first I just have to know, do we know why they prefer the emperor penguins to the Adelie penguins?
I have no idea, actually. I think at the moment it's just a correlation, right? Like, so we just saw that, they tend to like being nearby emperor penguins. That makes sense because they're on the same type of habitat, right? They both need fast ice connected to the continent. So I think that's more or less just they need to be in the same places, so they prefer to be nearby them. The Adelie penguin one is a little bit more perplexing because it makes slightly less sense, but the idea could be that they're going after the same type of prey, which is Antarctic silverfish. It's this fish that's maybe it can get kind of big and maybe about this big or so. And they both will go after that same type of fish. They'll go after different size classes, but it's the same type of fish. And so is there potentially some sort of competition between the seals and the penguins? I don't know yet. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But those are the kinds of questions that I think these really large scale surveys can help at least identify, as a question to answer.
Okay, I'm interested to learn a little bit more about this methodology. You said you were working with 300,000 people. So do you basically just make the satellite footage accessible to people and then we just start counting them? How does this all come together?
Yeah. So what TomNod did was they were purchased by Digital Globe in, I forget what year, but what they are able to do or were able to do at the time was, you're correct, to take those high resolution images and make them accessible to anyone in the world. And so, yeah, the way this would work is if you're interested in counting seals, you would go to tomnod.com and show up and start like scanning around and seeing if you could see seals. It was a fairly straightforward prospect. It was a little bit more difficult on the analytical side of things when we got our analysis or got our results back, and we realized that people tended to overcount seals quite substantially. So we had to have clever ways of kind of correcting for those overcounts. And we came up with a way of doing it, which was really great in a robust statistical way. But yeah, it was really great. It was really fun to see so many people excited to kind of see little black dots on the ice, as much as I was.
I got to ask about the seals, and I'm a little bit scared. You mentioned that the numbers that you saw were quite fewer than you were expecting. Do we know if that's because there's been some horrible trend or a decline in population, or if perhaps the original estimate was just severely skewed? What might explain that?
So basically what we know at the moment is we don't know. Any of those things could be true, but we simply don't know. And I don't think we'll ever really be able to compare accurately between those two timeframes, primarily because the data were collected in completely different ways. So, 40, 50, 60 years ago, those estimates were derived from ship-based observations. And so the ships can only get so far into the ice, and they're looking at probably a different demographic than we were looking at, and there's only so many places they could go and only be there for so long. So that's one way of going about it. And that's not inaccurate in any way. It's just a different way of gathering the data. For us, what we were able to do is get a full snapshot in the month of November around the fast ice. So that's the ice that's right next to the Antarctic continent. And that's a place where ships typically can't get into. So we're looking at a place that, ships just can't see. And we were able to do it from space, right? So two completely different ways of looking at the same kinds of information. So I don't think that we can really compare. I think now what I would say is we have a fairly solid kind of baseline as of 2011 of how many female Weddell seals there were in 2011. And so I think from this point forward, providing we collect the data in the same way and that we don't change things too much, we should be able to make comparisons from 2011.
Okay. So it's not necessarily true that hundreds of thousands of seals have disappeared, thank God. So we're tracking the number of seals. What other data points are we looking for besides that?
Yeah, so some of the other things that we look for is like, how many cracks are on the ice, if there's icebergs nearby, how far away from the coastline the ice goes. All of that information is really helpful for us because it gives us an idea of, kind of some of the things that the seals prefer. So we find that they tend to prefer kind of this optimum amount of fast ice. So it can't be too extensive, but it also can't be too minimal. They like to have cracks in the ice. And so that gives us a little bit of an understanding of kind of the fine scale habitat features that they tend to like.
Has the data been around long enough for us to identify any trends in either their behaviors or the population size?
I wouldn't say it's been around for long enough. So the thing about Weddell seals in particular is that they can live a really long time. They can live upwards of 30 years. And so, even if we started with 2011 as that baseline, that's only been 13 years. And that's, kind of a middle-aged at most. Probably still kind of a young, actually, Weddell seal, right? If they was born in 2011. Ideally, if you want to have an idea of how the trends are in a population, you'd want to have several generations worth of data. And so arguably, we would want to wait until like 2060 or something like that before we would have an idea of how the populations are doing. So that doesn't mean that we're not going to continually check. We absolutely will and are. But to really have an understanding of how the populations are doing and what drives those populations to increase or decrease, we really need a lot of data.
That makes sense. Also, you mentioned that they might prefer more or less cracks in the ice. I'm wondering why that might be important, and also what level of cracks do they prefer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reason Weddell seals, let me rephrase. The reason adult female Weddell seals like cracks in the fast ice is because that's where they haul out of the water to give birth to their pups. And the reason the fast ice is so great is because it gives them a lot of protection from the only predators that would go after them, which are other air-breathing predators like leopard seals or killer whales. And so if they have this kind of distance from the edge of the fast ice all the way back where these cracks are happening, they've got some really safe places to give birth to their pups. And the other thing I'll mention too is that the cracks are created by tidal action. So the tides go up and down, and that's what causes these cracks in the ice. And so oftentimes you'll see seals, kind of deep in the fast ice near some islands or near headlands or places where the ice meets the land. And then that tide kind of goes up and down, and it creates that crack in the ice. And so they're able to get out and give birth to their pups and raise them. And it's a really nice, safe place for them to be.
Okay, well, that's fascinating. Turning then to the future of collecting this type of data, maybe I'll ask you what sorts of research questions that we still have about the seals.
Oh man, where do I begin? So research questions about Weddell seals. I think you kind of hit on it a little bit earlier, which, just a minute ago, which is, how are they doing and what causes their populations to fluctuate. And again, and start to get at that question by looking at trends and seeing if we can start to get some sort of glimpse. And again, we're going to need a lot of data to really better understand if there's an environmental factor that influences their population. So that's one major one is, what causes their populations to go up or down? Is it, environmental factors? Is it being too close to another nearby seal colony? Do the penguins have an influence? Is there, an influence of predators or something? I mean, there's all kinds of things that could cause their populations to fluctuate. So we don't know that. I think another question that comes to mind that a lot of people, I think, go to right away because it's in the Antarctic is climate change. And so whether or not, climate change is having an impact on them, how their populations are likely to do as the sea ice changes and as sea surface temperature changes. There's all kinds of questions that are like that are definitely still out there and that we need to address.
Then it sounds like this satellite technology might be really instrumental in helping us answer those questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about the satellite imagery is that you can, quite literally, it's remote sensing. You can literally have a remote view of anywhere around Antarctica, providing the clouds aren't in the way. That's the one major issue with the optical imagery is that if clouds get in the way, or if it's kind of like a crappy day, that can make it really difficult or impossible to see them. But otherwise, if you get a nice clear image and it's of fast ice, there's a probability that there might be seals there. And so it's safe, it's effective, it's efficient, and it can really give us a lot of information that we wouldn't have normally had because we don't have to physically get to some of those places. And so I think that's a huge benefit of using the remote sensing.
With all this data to be collected and these satellites that make it easy, will we continue to rely on citizen scientists for these types of projects? Are there any opportunities that you know of or could see happening in the future where people who are interested might be able to get involved?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually don't know what the prospects are for citizen science in the future because the platform that I mentioned, TomNod, has now changed around quite a bit and has been bought and changed names and changed hands. And so I'm not sure how that platform is operating anymore. So I'd love to believe that there would be a way forward to involve volunteers again, but I'm just not sure how that might work. If it did, I think we've learned a ton the first time around to be able to do it better the next time we try it. So I guess watch this space and hopefully we'll be able to find out a way to do it at some point in the future.
Perfect. I also read that one of the motivations for collecting this type of data is potentially to inform policy. Do you have any specific policy recommendations that this research might inform, perhaps to protect the seals or any other conservation measures of any kind?
Yeah, so one of the policy, I guess, decisions or pieces of information that's drastically needed is obviously how many Weddell seals there are in an area in particular in the Ross Sea, which is now the largest marine protected area in the world. And the reason they're one of the key species we want to know how many there are and how they're doing is because they are important predators of Antarctic toothfish.
Toothfish, guys, anyone listening, you have to go back and listen to our episode on Antarctic toothfish with Dr. Gilda Cacavo. Definitely one of my favorite interviews I've ever done.
And we fish for Antarctic toothfish. It ends up on our plates as Chilean sea bass. And so there's this kind of question about, are we fishing sustainably? Are we having an impact that can't be undone? And that question is still out there. I think at the moment, we don't know one way or the other if it's impacting Weddell seals at all. As a matter of fact, we don't really know what causes their populations to go up and down, as I mentioned earlier. So I think there's still a lot of questions out there, but that's the kind of policy or the kind of information that international organizations and international policy needs is how many seals are there? How many penguins are there? And that will help inform whether the protection is helping or doing its job, or if there needs to be some other types of protections in place, and we simply don't know the answer to that. So yeah, that's where I would hope that some of the work that I do would be able to help provide that kind of information.
Speaking of penguins, are we using this data to track penguin populations as well, or are there any specific research questions that you have for penguins?
We do use the high resolution imagery to look for them as well. It's done in a little bit of a different way than we do with Weddell seals. So in the case of emperor penguins, what we have to do is, while we could go through and identify every single little black dot that we see on the ice, that would take a really long time and be very inefficient. And so what we do instead is we train the computers to tell the difference between the penguin pixels and other pixels on the landscape. So we're basically kind of just saying like, okay, here's what a pixel of penguin looks like. We train the computer enough and then say, okay, do the entire image and then tell me how many penguin pixels there are. And then using ground information from roughly the same time frame, we can then use that information to say, okay, if we counted, say, I don't know, 10,000 square meters of penguin pixel, how many penguins were actually there, on that day. And so that's how we go about looking for emperor penguins. And we actually just found over the past 10 years or so, we found there's a probability of decline of about 10% of emperor penguins in the springtime. But the one caveat that I have there is that it's a really, really specific group of penguins that we're counting. So there's definitely, in my opinion, not quite, we don't need to be raising alarms just yet. I think there's more information that we need to better understand before we get too concerned. It's worse than being stable, obviously, or increasing, but we don't know exactly what is the cause of that decline. It could just be that we're catching fewer of them. It could be that we are seeing them have lower breeding success. So there's all kinds of things that it could be. It might not be necessarily the fact that the birds are dying.
We talk a lot on the show about compounding issues and the different and multiple ways that species are under threat. And I hope we can get to the bottom of it. And I hope that this satellite technology might even be able to help us find those answers. I'm also glad that we have a lot of people working on this. I think we're going to start to round out to the last final questions. The first of which is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you think we should mention about either these projects or about your research in Antarctica more broadly?
I don't know. I guess the one thing I like to think about is there's a lot of nuance, and there's also a lot of things that can be kind of confusing when it comes to like thinking about Antarctica. Just as an example, ice. Like there's land ice, there's glacier ice, there's sea ice, and in sea ice, there's fast ice and pack ice, right? And so we don't really have an idea of how it's to my knowledge, like we don't really have an idea of what's going to happen with the fast ice, which again is that it's sea ice, frozen ocean water, but it's connected to the land. And that's where the seals and the penguins, emperor penguins, live. But the pack ice is the ice that's out in the middle of the ocean. And so that's the ice where we're seeing these declines now, where there used to be actually an increase in the extent of the Antarctic pack ice. We're now seeing this very, very strong decrease over the past few years, but it's in the pack ice. And so that's not to suggest it's not worrying. It definitely is, but there's nuance here when it comes to what's going to happen to those two animals in particular, the emperor penguins and the Weddell seals that live on the fast ice.
Maybe just to follow up on that, do we have enough data to show how their behavior has changed on account of that trend with the ice, or is it still too early?
I think it's still too early to tell. And again, the reason for that is because they're also a fairly long-lived species. I think they can live up to 20, maybe 25 years. So it's going to take a while to really see how they're doing.
Got it. Now I'm going to ask you, what is your favorite thing about Antarctica?
I think my favorite thing about Antarctica is probably the emperor penguins. They never get old. Weddell seals never get old either, but like seeing an emperor penguin walking on the ice is like, my heart always just like kind of, this is going to sound corny, but like it skips a beat a little bit. It's just like, oh my God, they're just so beautiful and magnificent. So yeah, I think my favorite thing about Antarctica is the emperor penguins.
No, I mean, that's definitely a good choice. They might be the most charismatic megafauna we have on Earth.
I think so. Yeah.
All right, then. Well, the last question I have for you is, where can people find you and follow your work?
So I have a website. My website is aptly named drmichellelarue.com. I am on Blue Sky now, and it's at Dr. Michelle LaRue. And I think if you Googled me, my name and University of Canterbury, you would see my website there as well. Yeah, so those are the places. Oh, and then also I do have a children's book about emperor penguins that is available for purchase as well. It was a lot of fun. So those are kind of the recent things that I've been up to as far as, kind of where you could find me on the internet.
Perfect. I will be sure to include links to all of those things in the show notes for people to find easily. This is the part where I say thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for teaching us about the satellite project and also for your really important research in this space.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You've been listening to South Pole. You can find more information about this week's guest and links to their work in the episode description. Cover art for the show is done by Laurel Wong, and the music you're listening to is done by Neela Ruiz. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and this episode was produced and engineered by me. And if you found it interesting, send it to someone you know. South Pole is part of a larger network of sciencey podcasts called Pine Forest Media. We've got one on plastic, one on drinking water, and a couple new ones coming out soon. And you can find more information about us in the episode description as well, or on our website at Pine Forest Pods. We are also on Instagram and the TikTok at Pine Forest Media. And if you love the show and you want to support science communication like this, a 5-star rating across platforms and a review on Apple Podcasts is one of the best things you can do to help us reach more people and for the entire network to grow. All right, thank you to all of you who have made it this far, and we'll talk soon.